My name is Paul Crowe, and I'm the director of the David Lanner Center. I'm also a professor in the Department of Humanities and teach for the Asian Canada program here at SFU. And I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to our first forum of the year, of the academic year. And it's a special treat today for us. We have our own Professor Rosalie Tung presenting. By way of introduction, for those of you who I'll give you some details. Rosalie is the Ming and Stella Wong Professor of International Business at Simon Fraser University. In 2003-04, she served as President of the Academy of Management, a leading association of 19,000 professors of management from around the world. A distinguished position. She was formerly Wisconsin Distinguished Professor of Business Administration at the University of Wisconsin-System. Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the Canadian Academy of Management, the Academy of International Business, and the British Academy of Management. She's published 11 books and over 90 articles on the subject of international human resource management, international business negotiations, and comparative management. And is also the editor of Comparative Management, the Journal of International Business Studies, and past editor of the Journal of World Business. I felt obliged to let you know that it's a tremendous amount of work to accumulate such an impressive record. So we're especially glad that Rosalie is willing to open up the forum for us this year. So we'll be discussing, hearing about brain circulation, revisiting this notion of brain drain, which seems no longer to be terribly relevant in the era of global migration. So without any further ado,
well, thank you very much, Paul. I'll have to adjust this so I can also move this at the same time, or maybe do it this way. That's easier. I'll be focusing on a number of studies that I've done, one of which came out 1.5 years ago, and the other one which has just come out. But because I know this is a public forum, so I will take away a lot of the statistics and really focus on the issues that would be of interest, and more or less focusing that on the implications for Canada. Okay, so the topic that I'll talk about today is brain circulation, and I'll briefly explain what it is. In the past, there was a lot of talk about brain drain, brain gain. So for instance, if we're looking at Canada and China, for instance, somebody that left China and then moved to Canada, it would be a brain gain on Canada's part and a brain drain on China's part. But increasingly, we see that we're no longer talking about the brain drain, brain gain, because people are increasingly becoming more and more mobile. So for instance, if let's say a Chinese moved to Canada, got his or her education here, worked here for a number of years, then left, go back to work in China, and then after a while, then the person decides to, come back to Canada or establishes dual businesses both in Canada and China, that would be a case of brain circulation itself. And so if we can look at some of the statistics in this regard, we see that the Chinese and Indians, which are two of the largest source countries of immigrants into Canada, both of those have been very active in terms of this brain circulation issue. So if we look at Silicon Valley, we see that 29% of all the IT startups in Silicon Valley were established by Chinese and Indian entrepreneurs. And in Saxenian studies, so Saxenian is a professor at Berkeley, and she found that the Chinese slightly outnumbered the Indians in terms of the Silicon Valley itself. But when a similar study was done by Duke University on the Research Triangle in North Carolina, the reverse was found, wherein the Indians slightly outnumbered the Chinese as far as IT startups in the Research Triangle were concerned. But regardless, we see that the Chinese and the Indians are competing neck to neck in these areas. And so we see that these companies generate a tremendous amount of sales and employed also quite a large number of people. And even if they were not the entrepreneurs, we see that many of the workers in the Silicon Valley are really foreign born. and also a lot of the founders of firms in the Silicon Valley were made by immigrants. So we see that even in the case of the Chinese and the Indians that have migrated to Canada or to the United States and have started businesses here and have taken up citizenships of Canada or the United States, many of them still have very strong ethnic ties. For instance, we see that in the case of the Chinese always believe that regardless of where they are all Chinese and they all belong to the one family. In the case of the Indians, in a BBC survey that was done in 2007, they found that the preference for East Indians or South Asians was that they would only marry people of their own kind, so that regardless of where they are, there was still this very strong ethnic tie. We also see here that the Chinese and the Indians have also contributed substantially to the transnational entrepreneurship, which is that because they're involved in this brain circulation, their children may still be living in North America, but then they establish dual businesses or dual beachheads in both Canada, the United States, and as well as in China and in India. So these are some of the examples of industrial parks or examples of areas where there are large pockets of transnational entrepreneurship. In Taiwan, which is this, that we see that in the Hsinchu Valley, which is in about 1 hour drive outside of Taipei. We see that in both Beijing and Shanghai in China, and of course in India we see that in the case of Bangalore. The term brain circulation has also been referred to as triangular human capital flow by Dvorak, and that was in the RIM project. And this is where, of course, we see that there are astronauts, okay, people that, you know, where they live, the adults themselves work, let's say in Hong Kong or in China, but then their children and their elderly parents are then in Canada, and they shuttle back and forth between the two communities itself. And in the studies that were done by Dvorak, they found that Canada can be referred to as a human capital entrepot, which is really not very positive, because what his studies found was that the skilled immigrants from Hong Kong in particular, once they receive their advanced education and they receive work experience here, they would leave and they would go back to Hong Kong. So we see that, of course, that would be a negative from Canada's standpoint. Then you would ask, why is brain circulation possible? I mean, why didn't we see this phenomenon, let's say, in the 50s or the 60s? And it's possible because of several things. Okay. The first is, of course, globalization, and I don't need to go into that. Globalization, of course, has contributed to this brain circulation. The second contributing factor is the reduction in immigration and emigration barriers to the movement of people. Increasingly, we see that it's easier for people to leave their countries of origin. I mean, if we're to look at the case of China, let's say back in the 70s, back in the 80s, it would be very, very difficult for somebody to leave China, but now, of course, it's easy. And also the barriers to entry into the advanced countries is also easier. A third factor is because dual or multiple citizenships has been permitted in many countries, so it's easier for people, you know, to go to another country and then, you know, also retain the citizenship of their country of origin. A fourth factor is the emergence of boundaryless careers. The concept of boundaryless careers was first introduced in the domestic literature, and it refers to the fact that because increasingly people feel that the companies are not as loyal to them as it was in the past. Therefore, if the company is not very loyal to me, therefore it's best that I find what is most intrinsic to my career itself. So people are more willing to make lateral kinds of moves from company to company and from country to country in order to find the positions that are most satisfying from their standpoint. And so in the studies that I did, I found that the concept of boundaryless careers applied to North American executives and also applied in the case of German executives. And the final factor that has made brain circulation possible is because of the high level of connectivity worldwide. So it's easy for somebody, let's say, to be working in one country, but still be in very close ties with people in other countries. And if we were to look at this in the context of Canada, we see that of the G8 countries, Canada experienced the second highest net population growth, so the United States was number one. But in the case of the United States, the reason for the net population increase was due to natural birth, okay? Whereas in the case of Canada, the growth was actually due to immigration. And so we see the two largest source countries, as I mentioned before, would be China and India. And I would say that immigration really is very critical to the international competitiveness of Canada. In the report that I did for the BC Business Council this past June, wherein I looked at immigration as one of the challenges and also, of course, one of the opportunities for Canada, is that if you look at the average age or the median age of people in British Columbia, it's pretty close to 40. And the median age in BC is higher than that for the rest of Canada as a whole, which is 38.8. So as a whole, Canada, as in many other industrialized countries, we are aging. And of course, as people age, then you can see that it's going to be more a drain on the revenue of the country itself, okay? So Canada and a lot of the other industrialized countries really are in dire need of younger people. And where are these younger people going to come from? Many of these would be immigrants. So, and the next two bullets would refer to the situations in China and India. China, of course, now is one of the largest source countries, but we see that because of the very success of the one-child policy in China, actually China will also be, or China is already starting to experience this aging population. So the projection here is that by 2020, that almost 12% of the Chinese population will be 65 years of age or over. So by 2050, you'll see that that figure, of course, would increase even very, very considerably. India, in that sense, enjoys the dividend or the advantage over China because India still has a very, very young population. So if we look at it, 30% or 340 million, which would be the same size as the entire population of the United States itself, is under the age of 15. So India enjoys the demographic dividend as far as where the future opportunities would be concerned. Then some of the other concepts that I'll be introducing here, which relates to the studies, I'll just load these first, would be the diaspora. And we see that it comes from two Greek words, okay? The diaspora was first used to describe the Jews when they were disbanded from their home country. But the term subsequently has been referred to a lot of other groups, other ethnic groups that have left their home countries. So the Chinese diaspora and the Indian diaspora, of course, are two of the largest in the world. So the Chinese diaspora by far is a lot larger. We see that it's estimated anywhere between 52 to 60 million outside of China. Most of them are primarily settled in Southeast Asia, and they control disproportionate amounts of wealth and businesses in these countries. So the estimated number, we see, even though absolute number-wise, it's lower in Canada, but if you look at the fact that Canada's population is about 1/10 that of the United States, so from the percentage-wise standpoint, there are a lot more Chinese immigrants to Canada as compared with the United States itself. If we look at the Indian diaspora, we see that it's an estimated 20 million Indian who live outside of India. And again, if we were to compare the figures, even though absolute number-wise, there are more ethnic Indians in the United States, but percentage-wise, again, Canada has a larger percentage of ethnic immigrants as ethnic Indians as immigrants. And if we were to look at the members of the diaspora, traditionally, they were viewed as victims. Victims from the standpoint that, first of all, they were evicted from their home country because of war or something of that sort, so therefore they'd have to be aliens in a foreign country. And secondly, because at that time when members of the diaspora had to be dispersed to other countries, they had to adapt to a foreign country, so they have to learn a new language, settle into new ways of doing things, and oftentimes were also the subjects of discrimination in foreign countries. But increasingly, we see that members of the diaspora are now viewed as challenges. So this was a term that Cohen used. And particularly when he was looking at the Chinese diaspora in Australia, he saw that there was very much of a presence of a trade diaspora, okay? Because the Chinese tend to be engaged in entrepreneurship at a much higher incidence than local Australians were. And so many of them were able to stimulate or drum up business between Australia and their country of origin. And if we look at some of the other studies, it shows that in the early years after China's liberalization, approximately 80% of foreign direct investment into China came from overseas Chinese. And between 1980 and 2004, 1/3 of FDI into China came from overseas Chinese. And we have the figures for 2006, wherein we see that Hong Kong and Taiwan are the largest and the 6th largest foreign investor in China. Therefore, really, the members of a diaspora can be perceived as dividend from the standpoint of promoting and stimulating foreign direct investment into the country itself. So again, if we could compare slightly some of the, I just want to be sure I'm loading the right ones. Okay. If we compare China and India, and the term Chindia was actually coined by Business Week in August of 2005, which refers to the combined might or the rising economic power of both of these countries, we see that both of these countries really have ascended very much in terms of economic power on the worldwide scene. For instance, if we look at the A.T. Kearney Foreign Direct Investor Confidence Index, this is an index that is based on surveys of CEOs and CFOs from around the world every year. So the latest Foreign Investor Confidence Index was in 2007, and they found that the CEOs and the CFOs that were surveyed still ranked China as the #1 country of investment. So this was since 2002, China has attained this #1 position, and India overtook the United States as the 2nd most desirable country for foreign direct investment in 2005. And we can see this is particularly interesting in light of the fact that China ranks low in terms of transparency, and transparency typically does have an impact in terms of foreign direct investment. But despite the fact that China is not perceived as a very transparent country, foreign investors are still very interested in making investments into China. And again, if we were to look at this in the context of immigrants from both China and India, prior to the 1960s, even though there were immigrants from both of these countries into Canada and the United States, primarily the kinds of positions that they occupied could be classified or characterized as water boy kinds of positions, which were in lowly paid kinds of occupations itself. And so they were really, to a certain extent, marginalized in the mainstream society itself. But if we look at the situation in the post-1960s, we see that many of these are high-tech immigrants. And because of the importance of the knowledge economy in the 21st century, we see that they really constitute part of the knowledge diaspora itself. And also studies have shown that, in fact, the Chinese and the Indian immigrants to both Canada and the United States are in general more highly educated and also wealthier in comparison with the general population in both of these countries itself. If we also were to compare China and India with regard to the ability to attract foreign direct investment, we see that China has been a lot more successful than India in terms of attracting foreign direct investment from members of the diaspora. But in terms of foreign remittances, we see that India outperformed China. So India is the country that has received the largest percentage of foreign remittances from overseas. In fact, it constitutes about 3% of that country's GDP. So if we're to continue with some of these comparisons between the Chinese and the Indian diaspora, China does not recognize dual nationality. Okay, so that is actually a negative. But we see that since 1991, with the promulgation toward encouraging overseas Chinese to return, so the government has been encouraging Chinese to build bridges of friendship and cooperation. India, on the other hand, in 2003 passed the dual citizenship law, which makes it possible for overseas Indians also to retain the non-resident Indian status. And we see that in the case of the Chinese President Hu Jintao did call for Chinese students to return, so trying to appeal to the patriotic sentiments. And here are some of the figures. We see that approximately 1/4 of the Chinese that went abroad to study between 1978 to 2004 returned. Okay, the return rate increased in 2004, 2005, and that coincided, of course, with the growing economic opportunities in China and the improved living conditions in China itself. But again, The last bullet that I have there really contributes to this notion of brain circulation in the sense that even though 40% of the people are now returning, but again, about 1/2 of those left again. So in other words, really a country cannot rest on its laurels by saying, well, like we have these people that return and now they're going to work with us for the rest of their lives. That's not going to be true. As economic opportunities change, many of these people that have dual citizenships would, at the drop of a hat, leave and go and work in another country. We see in the case of India, India was at first a little bit behind China in terms of making use or tapping into the resources of its diaspora, but very quickly the Indians or the Indian government has been very quick to pick up this notion of having annual conferences to attract the outstanding members of the diaspora to come back and make the investments in India itself. So we see that all of this brain circulation does have a lot of implications for the issue of international competitiveness, what is also referred to as the war for talent. We see this was the term that was used in the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2006. And if we're to look at some of the figures with regard to the United States, which currently is one of the largest beneficiary of the brain drain from, let's say, India and China, we see that there's a tremendous shortage of qualified candidates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the United States itself. And if we look at some of these statistics, we see that in 1966, 78% or close to 80% of the doctorates in science and engineering were born in the United States, whereas by 2001, only 61%. And so what were the largest countries of origin of foreign students? We see that China emerges number 1, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, India, and Canada. The stay rates also in the United States at present are pretty high. If we look at 2003, 70% of the Chinese graduates in computer science chose to remain in the United States. But as the economic conditions in the United States would decrease, and as economic conditions in China increases, we can see that many of these people, again, could just leave the United States. And particularly in light of the fact that the United States is making it more difficult for many of these high-tech visitors to renew the H-1B visas, that's going to even have a more negative impact on the United States itself. If we look at another study, which is Manpower Inc.'s 2006 white paper confronting the coming talent shortage, we see that there, by next year there will be a shortfall of 10 million workers in the United States. And we also see that, again, the current era has been referred to as a knowledge economy, and in a knowledge economy we see that tacit knowledge is what is most important, and tacit knowledge is something which is ingrained in people. Okay, I mean, tacit knowledge is not something that can be written down as a set of rules and regulations wherein you just read the rules and regulations and somehow you're able to perform. So if the country or if the company loses these people, which are the sources of these tacit knowledge itself, then you can see, in essence, it really will be losing that international competitiveness itself. I think one of the outstanding examples is if you look at the case of Kai-Fu Lee. He's a Taiwanese-born but US-trained engineer. He was working for Microsoft, and then he was poached by Google after working for Google for 4 years. Only very recently, I think it was just within the past week, he announced that he will resign and start his own company, which is a venture capital company called Innovation Works. And within 1 week, the company had no difficulty in raising $115 million. I mean, so this is quite an astounding feat in light of the economic crisis. And the purpose of his venture capital company is really to help finance engineers and other high-tech startups in China itself. So you can see that, again, Kai-Fu Lee would be an example of a boundaryless career, of a brain circulation, wherein his only loyalty is toward where like the best opportunities would arise. In the case of China, we see that whenever we talk about China, we say, oh, like it's a land of 1.3 billion, so how can it be short of people? I mean, true, it's got the largest population in the world, but there really is a great scarcity or shortage of talent within China itself. Okay, so in a McKinsey study, which was done in 2005, They talked about the shortage among plenty, but I like to look at that as a paradox of scarcity in the sense that there are a whole lot of people, but on the other hand, there's a tremendous shortage of qualified people. So we see that even down to the assembly line workers, there's a shortage of workers. And in 2005, when the study was done, okay, so one can say that the figures are a little bit outdated, but I would say that with the continuing investment in China, these figures really would still be very relevant. China will need 75,000 executives with international experience when currently the country could only have 5,000. Okay. And particularly in another study which was done, Hewitt Associates found that there was a tremendous shortage of managerial talent, leadership, creativity, autonomy, or risk-taking, marketing, and research. And because of this, we also see that there's a high turnover in positions in China. So the average turnover in 2005 was 14%, and this is particularly high in the major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So again, this shows that even if we're talking about firms that are operating in China, you still have to compete with your competitors or with other industries for the same talent pool itself. So one can ask, where is all this scarcity coming from? Okay, so there are many different sources of demand for Chinese talent. One is from the foreign invested enterprises. And earlier on, I said that China has been ranked since 2002 as the most desirable country for foreign direct investment. And so an estimated $1 billion is poured into China every week in terms of new investment. So you can see, of course, in order to run these investments, you do need human power. Many of the multinationals also choose to establish their R&D facilities in China. And if we look at some of the figures, in 2005, according to the UNCTAD study, China is the #1 choice for R&D expansion ahead of both the US and India. And if you look at some of the figures itself, in 2001, there were only 200 foreign invested R&D facilities in China, but in 2005, there were 750. So you can see that exponential growth there. And increasingly, more and more of these R&D facilities are not just engaged in the mere adaptation of the products, but also in terms of developing new products that would be suitable for the global market itself. So another source of demand for human talent, of course, is the China Go Global policy. And we see the Chinese government, of course, wants to develop the 20 to 25 national champions by 2010. And so from this standpoint, we can see some of the tremendous amounts of investment that the Chinese government has poured into R&D investment itself. Okay, so if you compare it with the United States, which is investing 2.7 by 2010, the Chinese will be investing 2.5% in terms of R&D. And the European Union Commission did acknowledge that by 2010, again next year, China's R&D expenditure as a percentage of gross national product will surpass that of Europe's. And particularly in light of the economic crisis itself, when we see that China is still able to maintain a 7.9% growth, whereas it's in a negative territory in both European Union and the United States and Canada itself, we see that obviously that those kind of percentages will change. So let's look at some of the findings with regard to Chinese firms that have invested overseas and see again where there's that dramatic need for talent. Of the study that was done by World Bank, 1/3 of Chinese enterprises have suffered losses on foreign investments and 65% of joint ventures failed. So those are quite high failure rates. But I think one way of looking at those figures is that aside from the Lenovo, aside from the Haiers, a lot of the other Chinese foreign investors are relatively small companies. So if we look at it in the context of small companies and compare that with small business failures in US and Canada, we see that that percentage or that figure is really not as bad as it appears. If we look at another study that was done by Fudan Globalization and IBV, granted that it was of a relatively small sample size, they asked these 25 companies, they asked these 25 Chinese firms that were going overseas, what was the most critical challenges to expanding overseas, and suitable human resources, okay, which got a ranking of 3.9 out of 5, emerged as the most significant challenge, whether internal or external. So it was really not so much of lack of knowledge of competitors in the foreign market, nor lack of financial resources, but really the lack of ability to have the human resources to help manage and run these operations. In another study, which was done by Batat and Akut in 2005, they also found that lack of understanding of host country culture really was the primary reason for failure of Chinese companies in investing overseas. So even though a lot of the studies have focused very much on the hard criteria or on the hard data itself, it really would be in the area of the soft criteria, such as lack of knowledge of the host culture, lack of human resources, that the Chinese companies are really short on. So currently, where are the sources of human power supply? Okay. So if we look at this tremendous demand for human talent in China on the one hand, and if we look at where the sources of human power supply are, one is the self-initiated assignees, the SIAs, okay? And so these could be ethnic Chinese, and I've coined the term ex-host country nationals to refer to people that are ethnic Chinese, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And we also see that quite a lot of the self-initiated assignees are from non-Chinese. Okay. In fact, there was recently there was an article in New York Times in August, which talked about how a lot of the non-Chinese, in light of the financial crisis in the United States, so these are graduates from Yale, from Harvard, but because of the difficulty that they have in finding positions in the United States, therefore they feel that it's really best to go to China, climb one or two rungs in their career, or if they were to start up their own business. So they were talking about like using $1,200 to start up a business in China as compared with, like how much more it would be to establish a business in the United States itself. But of course, all of these people don't plan to work in China for the rest of their lives. Many of them do plan to get as much experience or accumulate as much money as possible and therefore leave. And the other primary supply of human power would be the transfers. Okay, so these are people that are transferred by the companies, by the foreign multinationals that they're working for. These would be in terms of ethnic Chinese or ex-host country nationals, and also non-Chinese itself. Okay. So there was a study that was done by Heydrich and Struggles, which showed the, what the composition of the people that were working in these companies were. 40% were ex-host country nationals, 30% others, and Asia, from Asia Pacific, and 30% were Westerners. And again, some of the figures which showed the number of people, number of Chinese that were going overseas to study. Of course, these numbers are going to double by 2010. Okay, so again, the Chinese government really have to be pretty concerned about whether it's going to be able to attract these people to return. And we see that if we're to look at the figures in the past, that is in the 1990s, when a lot of the Chinese went overseas to study, they were funded by the government. So there was an obligation for them to return. But now, when more and more of the people are going overseas to study and they're self-funded, therefore, there's no obligation on their part to return. So from the Chinese standpoint, they could see that perhaps this brain drain on China's part would indeed worsen. So these are some of the figures that came from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences study that was done in 2008, where they see that the return rate overall for all the Chinese that went overseas to study was just 30%. So the Chinese have referred to this as the worst brain drain in the world itself. And some of the reasons why people are not choosing to return at this particular point is because of the higher incomes, the better job opportunities. But of course, this was done before the breakout of the 2008-2009 financial crisis itself. And particularly in the context of the United States, we see that 90% of the recipients of science and engineering degrees in the United States choose to remain. So because ex-host country nationals or people that are ethnic Chinese are one of the sources of human power supply, so the question that I pose is, can China then count on ex-host country nationals in its war on talent? And so here I'll briefly refer to my definition of what ex-host country nationals are, although I won't be able to go into this particular study itself. So what I've defined in terms of ex-host country nationals is something which is a little bit broader than the haiguis, which the Chinese use, because the haiguis, which are the floating sea turtles, I mean, if you follow that pun, okay, that refers only to the Chinese that were born and raised in China and then left and studied overseas. But in my definition of ex-host country nationals, I looked at primarily 3 different categories. And I find that the challenges, of course, these 3 different categories of Chinese to return to work in China would be different, okay? And so, therefore, if the Chinese government were really to attract these individuals to work in China to contribute to China's economic development, what would be the issues that would be associated there? The first category would be Chinese who were born and raised abroad, or raised abroad, okay? So these obviously may not even speak Chinese, okay? And, but again, because they still feel this tie to China that they might want to, you know, like return and at least, you know, like work for a period of time there. So I would say, you know, for instance, if I were looking at people in this category, my daughter would fall into that category. I mean, she was born and raised here. The second category would be somebody who's born in China and raised and educated abroad, and I think I would fall into the second category. And again, the challenges that I face, let's say if I were to return and work in China, would be different from what my daughter would face. Okay, and the third category would be Chinese who were born and raised in China and who've lived or worked extensively abroad, but essentially they still, of course, you know, have maintained very, very good ties in China itself. And again, the issues and challenges that they face are going to be different. Okay. So I won't go into this particular study, but I just want to point out that, in fact, if we look at ex-host country nationals, this is not just the first generation. In fact, the current you know, crop of ex-host country nationals that we're looking at really would be the seventh generations. Okay, so Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Chinese Republic, would be the second generation. Deng Xiaoping, the 5th generation, and the current generation would be the generation that is now, you know, that has received their Ph.D.s or advanced degrees from the U.S., UK, and Canada, and then now are establishing all of these companies in China itself. So I won't go particularly into the study. Then I draw upon some other research that have been done. The World HR Lab 2004 survey was a fairly large-scale study that was done in China of Chinese in 49 countries of over 3,000 people. And they asked questions with regard to whether people were willing to return to China. And I think some of these are really quite interesting, okay? So 88% of the Chinese that were studying overseas expressed the desire to return to work, okay? But the vast majority of them, over half, want to work overseas for several years and then return. So again, this has implications for the host country that they are currently living in. Okay. With regard to the reasons for returning, the primary reasons why people wanted to return is 70% of them were returning to seek better opportunities and future economic growth in China, and family reasons emerged as the second most important reason why these people want to return. With regard to what kinds of positions they want to work in, I think this is very interesting. About half of them want to work in the foreign invested enterprises. So even though it may be good from the overall Chinese standpoint, but if we look at it from the standpoint of China's Go Global policy, it really does not spell too well for it, because many of these choose to work for the foreign invested companies. And some of these found that, in fact, the Chinese companies were reluctant to hire the returnees. 14% want to start up their own companies. 3% want to work for the SOEs. Virtually most of the female that were surveyed do not want to work for the state-owned enterprises because of what they perceive to be the male-only policy in the state-owned enterprises itself. And also only 3% of these people want to work for the domestic companies. And in terms of locations, where do these people want to work? Not surprisingly, most of these prefer to work in Beijing and in Shanghai. And of course, this has implications for China's Go West policy, because if everybody wants to remain in, the most developed areas. But this is really not quite surprising, because in a study that I did with a colleague of mine on Central and East Europe, when we look at ex-host country nationals in Central and East Europe, we found that there was a major difference between the Central East European countries with high levels of Human Development Index vis-a-vis those with medium level of Human Development Index. So for the countries that were high on the Human Development Index, like the Czech Republic, like Hungary and Poland, they had no difficulty in attracting the returnees to remain. But for countries that were in the medium HDI category, which would be countries like Romania, which was most short on human talent, that was where the returnees were not willing to remain and work. So I'll just quickly go through some of these, because I do have, okay, whoops. Okay. So we, for those of you that follow the Chinese scene, and I know that there are a lot of Chinese experts here, so I, really need to, be a little bit cautious about what I say. We see that in the case of the Chinese that first returned, they were referred to as the sea turtles, and opportunities abounded in China. But of course, subsequently, or more recently, many of them have been referred to as the sea kelp, which of course is a pejorative. And part of that stems from the difficulty that they have in finding good positions. I think some of the reasons also could be that because in the past, when they were going away under government's sponsorships, of course, they really have to be the cream of the crop. But now when they're going under self-financing programs, then in essence, anybody could go. And secondly, because many of these people are leaving at a much earlier age, so many of them really have lost the business networks or contacts that they should have in the home country itself. And also, because many of them currently are self-financed, and their parents have paid a whole lot of money to help them seek their foreign education, so many of them have great expectations as far as what kind of salaries they should be getting. So they're being perceived as arrogant by a lot of the host country nationals. So this is where I turn to the first study that I did, which is to look at whether Chinese students, particularly in disciplines that are in great demand in China, are willing to return to work in China itself. So this was a survey of business students in business administration, engineering, and computing science. And the average of these 109 students is that they have lived 56.2 months outside of China. And I think it's important to at least have that little bit of a distance so that you can see, they have experienced, let's say, the Canadian way of life, and then they can compare the two situations. Okay. We see that about a third of them said that they were willing to, go back and work in China. Okay, 45% said they don't know how long they plan to remain in China if they were to return. About 30% said definitely no. Okay, and about 40% said they were not sure. With regard to the type of company they plan to work for, this is actually even worse than the World HR study. We see that 17.4% wanted to work for the foreign investment enterprises. Okay, 19.8% want to set up their own company. So this spells well for the entrepreneurial instincts. But 0%, none of them want to work for the Chinese company in China. So again, if the Chinese government was really counting on overseas Chinese or ex-host country nationals to help, its Go Global policy, then unfortunately it's not very good. And a lot of the respondents said that it really depends upon the best available opportunity. So a lot of the Chinese respondents are very pragmatic from the standpoint of sitting on the fence. And the second questionnaire survey that I did was of Chinese students in business administration, engineering, computing science at the same university, and asking them essentially two questions. One is whether they're willing to work for Chinese companies or subsidiaries in North America. And the second category of questions was whether they were willing to work for a Chinese company in China. Okay. So with regard to whether they were willing to work for a Chinese majority, a wholly owned company in Canada, North America, about a third said yes, about 60% maybe not sure, and 12.5% definitely not. And if you compare this with the responses with regard to whether they're willing to work for companies in China, okay. And by the way, that because of one of my collaborators in Denmark, so he also collected the same type of data in Denmark, and the results were pretty consistent. So with regard to whether non-Chinese students were willing to work for Chinese companies in China, only 7.5% said yes. 50% said definitely not. Okay, and so you can see that, and one of the primary reasons why many of the non-Chinese students didn't want to work for a Chinese company was they felt that the Chinese company, regardless of whether it was privately owned, it was part of the Chinese government. So a lot of the non-Chinese students are unable to distinguish between Chinese government policies, the Chinese government, and private companies. And so if the Chinese government were to attract non-Chinese to work for them, I think there has to be a tremendous education as to like what the policies of these Chinese companies would be. Okay. The third study that I have here is looking at the role of what is referred to as the immigrant effect. Okay. And so the immigrant effect, okay, I'll just load these first. Okay. The immigrant effect would refer to companies, okay, so i.e. would refer to companies that are either owned or founded by immigrants or who hired immigrants in key decision-making positions. So that as a result of the presence of these immigrants, or as a result of the fact that it was actually founded and owned by an immigrant, would it actually increase the probability that the firm would make the investments in their country of origin? And if so, would it also affect the mode of foreign market entry? So, and I'll talk about that more. So what we're looking at here is that immigrant effect could be viewed as a form of social capital. And in this study, okay, even though I'm just reporting on the one with regard to Asia, we find that immigrant effect or social capital can also be applied in the case of European Union as well. Because in a lot of the social capital literature, many of the arguments was that social capital would be more relevant in lesser developed countries where institutional laws are less developed, so therefore social capital becomes more significant. But in this study, we found that for firms that were owned or started by, let's say, Europeans, then it also tended to increase the probability that they will make the investments in the European Union countries as well. So the study that I'm talking about here just came out in Asia Pacific Journal of Management, and it's done with a colleague of mine in New Zealand. So why did we choose Australia? Okay. First of all, Australia is a large country with a small population. Therefore, by definition, it's outward-looking. And secondly, after the UK joined the European Union, Australia had to develop its trade ties or its economic focus with Asia Pacific. About a third of Australia's population is foreign-born, okay, and China also has displaced Japan as Australia's largest trading partner as of last year. Okay. So if we were to look at, again, why we were using Australia, we see that about 3.4% of the people in Australia identified themselves as Chinese. This is pretty consistent with the study that was done by the World Migration Report, which showed that about 3% of the world's population would characterize or classify themselves as immigrants. So these are people that are moving. We see that despite this overall 3.4%, there are higher concentrations in Sydney and Melbourne, and the early settlers came from the Pearl River Delta, which would be from the south of China. And in the study, although I won't go into it here, is that we did distinguish between the Chinese that came from Hong Kong, the Chinese that came from the mainland, and also the Chinese that came from Taiwan. So in order to look at the immigrant effect, it would be, let's say, if a company were started by somebody from Hong Kong or hired immigrants from Hong Kong to make the investment in Hong Kong, that would be the immigrant effect. And similarly, it would apply in the case of Taiwan, so immigrants from Taiwan. And in the case of mainland, it would be people from mainland China that would be investing back in China itself. So I won't go into the differences, but there are similarities. All of them do tend to be very entrepreneurial. And so here you can look at some of the, the business immigration into Australia itself, and the vast majority of that came from Hong Kong and 15% from Taiwan. And the reason why all of them tend to focus in returning back to their countries of origin is to take part in the economic growth in China. I'll just go through these a lot more quickly because these pertain more to the literature review part of it, and I think they would be less interested in it. But we see that immigrants can be an important source of social capital, and this is really tying it back with the foreign direct investment literature as to how the use of immigrants can reduce somewhat the psychic distance that exists between the country of origin and also the country of residence. Okay, so there are these models that show that firms tend to adopt an incremental approach, and so by the social networks or by the special knowledge that immigrants have, they can really help leapfrog the internationalization process because of the special knowledge that they have. So we looked at these hypotheses. We had a 6-page questionnaire, pilot tested, and also the firms that we pulled from were from the directory of Dun & Bradstreet. And for an extra fee, you can actually get the names of the CEOs of these companies. So that's what we did. And we had 6 different hypotheses here. I'll just quickly go through the hypothesis without going to a lot of the literature review part of it. So our first hypothesis were that firms that have social capital in the form of immigrants, of immigrant effect, were more likely to pursue a higher resource commitment mode. So firms that were either started by immigrants or hired immigrants in key decision-making positions were more likely to enter via wholly owned operations or joint ventures as compared to those firms that did not have these kinds of social connections. So for firms without these social connections, in order to reduce the risk, in order to reduce the lack of knowledge, most probably they would enter via exporting mode. The second hypothesis was that where there's a significant difference between the consumer or customer market in the home and the target country, so if we're looking at, let's say, Australia and China, if there is a tremendous difference in terms of the consumer attitudes in both of these countries, we would see that there would be a greater tendency to use immigrants because they could then adopt more of the appropriate marketing strategies. And the example we used here was outboard marines, because if we look at outboard marines in the advanced countries in Australia, for instance, typically it's used for recreational purposes. Okay, I mean, typically people would use that for water skiing and so on and so forth. But in China, in Taiwan, and in Hong Kong, many of the outboard marines would be used for commercial boats itself. Okay, so the audience or the customers that you're selling to would be quite different. Our third hypothesis was that where there's a significant difference in the product life cycle, and we see that products do have different product life cycles, which are not always in sync in different countries in the world. Okay, so in the advanced countries, it may be in the more advanced phase, where it might be in at the introductory phase at a lesser developed country. So if we see that there is a significant difference in product life cycle between the country of origin and also the target market itself, we see that there would be a greater tendency, again, to rely on the social capital that was inherent on the part of the immigrants in order to pursue the right kind of marketing strategies. So here we use the example of Volkswagen's Santana. For those of you that have been to China, of course, you see that a lot of the taxis in Shanghai, for instance, would be the Santana, whereas Santana is an older car that was manufactured by Volkswagen in Germany, and so you seldom see the Santanas being used in Germany itself. Our fourth hypothesis was that firms with a longer history of operations in the target market are less likely to be dependent on social capital. So our argument was that if a firm has been in international business for a long period of time, or if they've operated in the target country for a long period of time, they have accumulated so much knowledge that they really would have lesser need of the immigrants or the immigrant effect. And our last two hypotheses were 5A is firms with social capital are more likely to enjoy a better performance, and performance was measured in terms of sales growth, market share, and profit. Okay, so our hypothesis was that if a firm has more knowledge, more business networks through social capital, then they would be able to enjoy better performance. And our last hypothesis here was that firms that adopt a higher resource foreign market entry mode, that is enter via joint ventures or wholly owned, would also exhibit higher performance. So this is the figure. This is the research framework, and we used structural equational modeling, specifically PLS. Okay, so I won't go into the specifics of it, but if you're interested, I mean, obviously, I'd be happy to share the findings of that with you. So this was the model that we tested, and I'll just briefly look at this. We had 60 of the companies were doing business with China, and 75 were doing business with either Hong Kong or Taiwan. I won't bother you with all the specific details, but I just want to draw your attention to two of the lines. One is there was a higher percentage of firms that used IE in China as compared with Hong Kong and Taiwan. So if you look at the line IE, 50 versus 37%, we see that even though, and this is really jumping a little bit onto the findings itself, even though we didn't find there was significant difference, but in terms of the percentage-wise, we see that there was a higher incidence of firms that were doing business in PRC that relied on the immigrant effect. And also a larger percentage of the firms were engaged in this particular study, and that was the nature of the sample itself, were engaged in the non-service sector itself. So jumping to the findings, okay. First, we found that firms with social capital were more likely to employ a higher resource commitment mode. So it did support our finding that firms that had the kind of necessary networks in the target market were more willing to commit more resources. And that's understandable because anytime when you enter via a higher involvement mode, that is entering via wholly owned or joint ventures, it does involve much more risk. So therefore, if you know the target market more, the probability is higher, that you'd be more willing to commit to higher resources if you have that social capital. The second hypothesis, which is differences in customer behavior, was positively related with the deployment of IE. We found that that was true. The third hypothesis, okay, which is the product types would influence the deployment of immigrant effect in terms of the choice of foreign market entry mode, we found that that was not supported. So our argument was that if there was a much greater difference between the home and the target markets as far as the product was concerned, the greater the likelihood that you would use the immigrants, but we found that that was not true. So our hypothesis was maybe there are two things that could possibly explain for it. One is, since opportunities tend to abound in the emerging markets, okay, so all types of products and services may be suitable. That's one way of explaining for why it was not significant. The more negative way of interpreting this non-significant finding is that perhaps all of these markets, despite the fact that Hong Kong and Taiwan are more developed than China, all of these markets still pose problems and pose challenges for all types of foreign investors, so regardless of the type of product that you're using. The fourth hypothesis was also not supported, so we find that immigrant effect did not differ across type of market. So we see that for the Australian firms that operated in China, they were not more likely to deploy immigrants in comparison to counterparts that do business in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Because the argument is that because both Hong Kong and Taiwan tend to be a little bit more similar to Australia, therefore there may be less of a need. Whereas China, there would be the greater cultural distance, so you may need to have that. But again, it did not make that difference. Okay, so it was not statistically different. And so again, there are these are some of the possible explanations for this, is that despite the fact that Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Australia are more similar to Australia than China, but perhaps there's still enough psychic distance for Australian investors to enter into any of these markets itself. Okay, and the second possible explanation for this is that products and services, regardless of which of these Chinese markets that they're entering into, it still requires special knowledge of the immigrants. And the example that we use here is the Domino spaghetti sauce. Okay, the spaghetti sauce, if you look at how it's being used in Australia, it's typically something that you just use from the can and then pour it onto the spaghetti or pasta that you're using. But in the Chinese markets, typically, and this is regardless of whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, typically it's mixed with vegetables. So it becomes a separate dish in itself. Okay, so therefore, for an Australian company, regardless of the fact that they're entering to Taiwan or Hong Kong, they still would have to understand the different usages of the product, and therefore it's still necessary to have the immigrant effect. But as I showed you from the huge matrix that I had earlier on, the incidence of firms that were operating in China was still higher, that they employed the immigrant effect as opposed to those without, okay, even though it did not come out as statistically significant. And the last hypothesis, it was also, it was not found to be significant. There was no difference in performance between IE and non-IE. So whether the firms had immigrant effect or not, it really did not impact the performance in terms of market share, growth, and so on and so forth. So the argument or the hypothesis for this could be that because these markets are so highly competitive, okay, there really is no silver bullet or quick fix to attaining success in these markets. So therefore, you still have to, go it slow in these markets itself. So this was the explanation that I had, and then that for companies that were larger size and that have a circular kind of argument, because of the higher incidence of success in the past, so therefore they're able to hire immigrants, therefore it tends to make them stay in the business longer, hence the longer longevity of the firm itself. So based on these three studies, and I know that I've been going through these fairly quickly, is that we can draw several conclusions, okay? So I know these are not so much the theoretical conclusions, but the shortage of human talent can really create the most significant challenge to, or create the bottleneck for a country's ability to attract and sustain international competitiveness. So therefore, it really is a competition for human talent, and particularly with brain circulation, governments on both the receiving and the sending countries have to be more aware of this issue. Also in light of so what are the implications for host government? What are the implications for the indigenous companies? And as far as implications for cross-cultural research is concerned, I would say in the past, perhaps there was too much of a distinction between people that were expatriates and then people that were host country nationals. But with this whole issue of brain circulation itself, increasingly the appropriate question is, who is an expatriate and who is a host country national? Because we can see that a host country national could be somebody who actually was expatriated from the country where they had resided for quite a period of time. And so in terms of the whole international human resource management program, it has tremendous implications for, in terms of staffing. Like who do you select? How do you select? What kind of training do you provide the people? So the traditional kinds of training may no longer be appropriate. How do you compensate these people, particularly when they focus more on the intrinsic career itself? And what are the criteria that you use in terms of performance appraisal itself? So I think we still have about 15, 20 minutes left. So with that, I'll open the, I'm open to questions. Yes.
You have this magnificent presentation, and I have three short questions to ask you. Correct me if I'm wrong. When you talk about brain circulation, leaving India aside for the moment, you're talking about Chinese born in China or ethnic Chinese born in the United States and Canada. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You leave aside all the others, the Canadians, white people, or German, or some people. Okay. Naturally, there's a language problem, which is very important for a Canadian who is not Chinese origin, or he's born in China and he has kept his language to go to China where the companies are a lot easier. most intellectual, most Chinese businessmen speak English fluently, so for them there's no problem. Second question, I was very surprised when you mentioned the 2008 brain drain from China. It's enormous. And you mentioned, well, it's because the economy now is not very good, it will change. But I would say when the economy goes back strong again, don't you think the brain drain will remain? And what are the reasons? Because they prefer the life in America and so on.
Okay. With regard to your first question, yes, the challenges would be different, and even for the people that I classify, which would be ethnic Chinese that are, you know, that are the ethnic Chinese, but those who were born and raised here, their language challenges, language issues. But I would say that increasingly, because people are choosing to like either to return or choosing to return back to their current country of residence. So I think it has tremendous implications in terms of human resource management policies and practices, because many, I mean, if you look at the human resource management practices of a lot of the multinationals, they're really based very much on the tradition of expatriate, you know, people that are being sent overseas, so therefore we need to provide certain kinds of agreements and so on and so forth. So I'm talking about it more in terms of that kind of implications itself. I mean, obviously, again, for the Caucasians that choose to work in China, they do tend to face a lot more challenges, but also in terms of their, let's say, adjusting to the living in China, it might be different too, because the host country nationals might perceive them very differently. So that's another whole challenge, a whole set of issues that I've looked at in another study. Because from the standpoint of host country national, let's say I'm an ethnic Chinese that is, you know, like born and raised in China and living there. When I see a Caucasian that I have to interact with, I tend to be more understanding. Let's say if you came and you didn't speak the Chinese language itself, but I tend to be, you know, less forgiving if you look like a Chinese, if you're an ethnic Chinese and you don't understand the language itself. So I think it's a whole different set of issues itself. The other question with regard to brain drain, yes, as the economic, I assume you're talking about the economic conditions here, right?
Yes, or the culture, the freedom, and so on compared to living in China.
Yes, yeah. But on the second question, when we talk about when we expect the brain drain to
intensify. Well, you said that these are very bad. This is a very bad figure, the brain drain in 2008, 30%, yes. If I remember well.
Yes.
Do you just want to go back to China? So 70% want to remain in the US or Canada. Yeah. And I say, you said, well, maybe it will change with the economy not being very good now, but when the economy gets good again,
gets better,
maybe you'll have the same problem.
Yes.
And I was wondering, what are the reasons why these 70% prefer to live here?
I think currently still the incomes, I mean, in general, I'm not talking about some of the exceptional cases, but in general the incomes, let's say for somebody who's an engineer, is higher here as opposed to China. Typically the quality of life is better. And I know that Simon, who is an ex-host country national, can perhaps talk a little bit about that more. But the quality of life in general for the family tends to be better, let's say in Canada or the United States itself. So there are those kinds of issues itself. But I think it really depends upon how the world evolves in the years to come. I mean, even though we may be coming out from the recession, but China continues its pace of economic development, and China's role in the G20 countries has increased significantly with the 2008-2009 crisis. In fact, I was reading the New York Times yesterday or from China Daily that said if there was such thing as a good crisis, it would be China. Okay, so I think China's role really has, China's standing in the international or the global community really has increased quite considerably with the financial crisis itself. So again, but I think the whole point of this is that really no country can rest on its laurels by saying now, like we have these people in our country, they have taken up from citizenship. Okay, in the World HR Survey, they found that 93% of the Chinese have actually taken up foreign citizenship. Okay, which means that they really can go back and forth between whatever countries they choose to go to. And so really no country can rest on its laurels, so you cannot say that, well, because this person is a country of Canada or is a citizenship of the United States, therefore we can expect these people to remain here for the rest of their lives. And most probably they won't.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Rob?
I'd like to join the previous speaker in thanking you for a very clear presentation on a fascinating subject. But I have a question for you. And it revolves around 3 incidents that have been reported recently. And I guess the basic question is, do you think that what seems to be Chinese uneven respect for the rule of law will intimidate the flow of the brain circulation, that people who've lived in the West for a long time become used to the rule of law, be intimidated by this? I think particularly the case of the Rio Tinto executives from Australia, one of the biggest mining companies in the world, in the midst of a high-level negotiation on the price of iron ore. It looks to the outside world, at least, as if the Chinese are using legal means to intimidate the executives. I mean, they have arrested and jailed 2 senior executives, charging them with stealing state secrets and bribery because they seem to be outdoing the Chinese on the price of ore. That's one, but that's a high-level case which has put fear in all of the mining companies, because Rio Tinto is so well known. If they can do it to an overseas Chinese from Australia, they can do it to somebody from Canada or wherever, first part. Secondly, there was a report recently from the European Union about, I think, 600 cases of misuse of the law, legal intimidation of people affecting trade, that the European Union says they're going to stand together and really stand up to the Chinese on this. Thirdly, just the other day, I participated in a briefing for Mr. Ignatia, who was then planning to go to China. He postponed the trip, but nevertheless there was a briefing for him to go to China. Most people spoke encouragingly about it. One very prominent law professor here in town, who knows China very well, knows Chinese law very well, spoke bitterly about recent change in China, in which every Chinese lawyer or judge that he's helped train, he now feel intimidated. They feel intimidated because the law is being used against them when they try to defend clients, just for trying to get respect for Chinese law. That is a change under this administration. That didn't happen under Zhu Rongji, but nevertheless, all of these things together, is it just coincidental, or is that something that's going to bother people?
Sure. I do agree with you that I mean, in the Rio Tinto case, and I've personally heard of cases where the Chinese are now flexing their muscles a lot more than they did in the past, where, you know, like suddenly there are changes in regulations, for instance, in the custom code, and then suddenly like a firm is accused of such and such. And so the company, in order to remain in business, either has to pay huge fines or some of its employees are arrested. So I think these are cases in addition to the Rio Tinto case itself. So obviously that can be one of the challenges of doing business in China. So to what extent is this China flexing its muscles, and to what extent this will continue, and if this were to continue, how it's going to affect foreign investor perception of doing business in China, I think that remains to be seen. But I think more importantly, this in terms of relating to what I'm looking at here, I think the cases of the employees that have really been arrested, in Rio Tinto, primarily would be ethnic Chinese. So ex-host country nationals are really the people that seem to have the greatest challenge in terms of doing business there. So on the one hand,
I think they have dual nationality. Yeah.
Yes, but still ethnic Chinese, but have taken on foreign citizenship. And I think one can find that there would be lots of instances of those kinds of issues. So I think perhaps that lends more support to my argument that really it would be difficult to treat all of these just as expatriates, because not all expatriates are equal. And furthermore, for the ethnic Chinese who were born and raised there, I think the challenges that they face, because they still may have parents and family there, whereas let's say for those that are foreign born, their family's all like it's all over the country, that's a different kind of situation. So increasing really, when companies choose these individuals because of their special knowledge of China, so that's an advantage, but on the other hand, there's also this drawback. And I've discovered, this phenomenon, even when we take away the context of, like people being put in legal jeopardy kind of issue. When I first started studying on this whole issue of expatriate assignments, I find that people who share the same nationality as the members of the target country, usually have some kind of love-hate relationships with the target country that they're sent to. So I think this was a part of the motivation for my looking at this whole issue of excellence country nationals. So I think, again, that's one of the challenges. And perhaps it may lead to revisiting of really who do you assign to work in China. So I don't think it directly answered your questions, but I think it touches on some of those issues. So, thanks. Yes, Simon?
Yeah, one comment and one question. On your work, you talked about seventh generation Chinese diaspora. They are changing from sea turtle to sea cow and facing difficulties in finding opportunities in China. I think part of the explanation is that the younger part of those seventh generation is the product of one-child policy, one-child only policy. And these guys go overseas at a young age. It's a very different set of people because they, if they're educated in China, they are experiencing very high unemployment right now because of the, arguably because of the lack of teamwork, lack of spirit of sharing, much more self-centric. That's because of the product, it's a social cost that China has to pay for the one-child only policy. That's one comment. I have one question. With $2 trillion US reserve in hand, China is now buying a lot of companies overseas, other than buying US bonds. And last night I was searching on Google.ca and just put in 3 words: China, buy, Canada. And on the first page, just first page of search results, I'm taking notes, filled with 1 page of notes on cases Chinese are buying up Canadian companies, mostly resources. Cases like Sinopec buy AX at $8 billion US. Sinopec has bought 10% in Northern Lights. And the list just goes on. My question is, what are the implications for those Chinese companies buying into Canadian firms, sometimes buying up, sometimes buying a share? The implications for Canadians, whether they're ethnic Chinese, native Canadians, whatever, what are the implications, opportunities, how we take advantage of that? I suppose that this type of buying is going to increase. Do you have any advice for us?
I think that's a very broad question. I would say, obviously, from the standpoint, that Canada has received a lot of foreign direct investment, and since a lot of the foreign investors into Canada are from the United States itself, I think from a diversification standpoint, it would be good for Canada to have a more diversified portfolio rather than depend solely on one country or primarily on one country. So I think that's a positive. On the other hand, I think because China is buying into a lot of the natural resources itself, it generates, I think, animosity or fear on the part of the host country that China may be buying into scarce natural resources, and therefore many Canadians really don't want to have their foreign natural resources being controlled from overseas because they're afraid the Chinese will just take advantage of these, and that really does not create the kinds of advantages. I think anytime when there is foreign investment, there are always pluses and minuses, but I think it does, in the better case scenario, it does create jobs and it does create revenues for the country that it's making the investment in, and I think for the current economic situation it would be good. But what I see that is taking place in Canada and the United States at this point is very much a repeat of the situation that I saw of the concern that the United States had with Japanese investment back in the 1980s. For instance, when I think back of the early days of my career when I was looking a lot at Japanese investment in the United States, I just saw that there was so much concern, there was so much reluctance, even though the Japanese were not important direct foreign investors in the United States itself, but the UK, there was no complaint anytime when there was a UK firm purchasing of any of the resources here. I similar. You don't hear too much about U.S. investment here, okay? But anytime if it's let's say a Chinese company that wants to buy up any of the companies, then you hear a lot more about that. And I think part of that stems from the inability to separate, like what really is the action of the Chinese government. Although in the cases that you're mentioning, because a lot of these are really state-owned companies, so in that sense, they're really on the Chinese government.
So I should be a bit more specific. Implications on HRs for people looking. I guess as more Chinese capital are coming in, there will be Chinese sitting on the board.
Yes.
And in the case that we control 100% of the companies, then Canadians are effectively working for Chinese boss.
It could be, yes.
Which
would then directly fit into the study that I was, talking about, which is that even though many Canadians are receptive to it, but still there's that concern. And I think it also, well, what I didn't talk about here would be the fact that many of the Caucasians or many of the non-Chinese students that are willing to work for the Chinese companies, even here, would look at that as a second best alternative, which means that if I can find a better job with a Canadian company over the US or the UK multinational, I much prefer to work for those kinds of companies. But if the job opportunities are going to be pretty limited, therefore, but if there's a Chinese investment here, they're probably going to work with it. But it's only really the second best or it's not their top choice, put it this way. But I think the implication also is because of the very different mindset, particularly if a lot of the people that are going to really hit these operations are going to come from China, who may not have the foreign experience. And I think there's a tremendous bridging of the gap between the Chinese bosses and also of the host country nationals. And I think we do see that in the case of Lenovo when they moved the head office to the United States and they hired an American as the CEO. Even though the real reasons were not very much disclosed in the press itself, I think that some of that really was due to the inability of the American to get along with the Chinese board, let me put it this way. So I think there's going to be that gap.
Well, I hate to cut off discussion, and perhaps afterwards there might be a few minutes as well, but thank you very much to Professor Tung for sharing your careful research, a very precise presentation, general expertise in this area. I'd like to call on Professor Emeritus Janet Walls, the founding director of the David Lamb Center, to confer a small token of thanks for the presentation.
This one is not the traditional small token, which is usually a ballpoint pen that has David Lamb Center for International Communication. Rosalie has been a contributor, a supporter, and a navigator and an administrator of the forums since we enticed her here back in the 90s. I'm proud to say that we're contributing to the U.S. brain game. We brought her here from Wisconsin. One of the nice things about being retired, there's so many, I won't waste your time. One of the really nice things is you don't really have any responsibility, but you occasionally get the honor of doing nice things like presenting thank you mementos to speakers who have actually done all the work. But this is not the largest fountain pen in the world. This is a very fine, I am assured, Inukshuk, which everybody knows by now is our Canadian symbol for the 2010 Olympics. And the symbolism here, of course, is to show appreciation for the Olympic efforts that you have made through the years. Contributions, not just internationally.
Well, Jen is also good with his words. Okay. All languages.
let me finish. Inukshuk means in Inuit for human and likeness. It's a human likeness, but what it really means when you see them on the landscape, it means humans have been here, and specifically, you're on the right track. Thank you.
So before I let you leave, I should let you know that we have an upcoming forum event on October the 8th as well. Dr. Mike Peng, he's the Provost Distinguished Professor of Global Strategy at the University of Texas, Dallas, is going to be coming, will be right here in the very same room, giving a talk titled, China Goes Global, Impact on Research and Practice. If you're interested, the information is outside on the table. And finally, we have another very special guest coming, Mathieu Ricard, who began his life as a researcher at the Pasteur Institute, but wound up spending 30 years living in Tibet. He's participated in brain state research at Harbour, Berkeley, Madison, Wisconsin, and is going to be talking on the roots of altruism, and whether or not altruism is actually a basic impulse in human beings or not. Fascinating subject, I would think. So thanks again to all of you for coming. I'm very glad you made it. Look forward to seeing you.